Dawn crept across the flat American landscape, pale and uncertain, as the train screeched to a halt in a haze of dust. The cars were crowded with women, German nurses, secretaries, kitchen workers, most too tired to even look out the window. Their journey had taken days. Fear had stolen their sleep, hunger had sharpened their nerves, and as the heavy doors groaned open, it was fear that held them upright. They stepped down in stiff uniforms, clinging to battered suitcases and bundles of letters, their eyes darting past the lines of barbed wire. The camp looked nothing like the ruined cities they'd left behind. There were neat rows of wooden buildings, watchtowers, flags snapping in the wind, and American soldiers standing at attention, rifles slung, faces impassive. Some women tried not to meet the eyes of their captors, expecting cold stares. Or worse, they'd heard rumors whispered on crowded bunks that Americans were vengeful, that the war had made monsters of everyone. One nurse clenched a family photo in her pocket, remembering her mother's warning, "Never let them see you cry." Another, barely 18, fixed her gaze on the gravel, rehearsing silent prayers. Yet, as they shuffled forward under the watchful gaze of the guards, something strange happened. The soldiers didn't shout. There were no angry dogs, no blows or jeers. Instead, one young guard, his accent strange but gentle, called out, "Welcome to camp. You'll be safe here." Another handed out small slips of paper, translated instructions, and pointed quietly to the canteen. Some of the women exchanged uncertain glances. Could this be a trick? Was kindness a mask for something darker? Every step into that camp felt loaded with peril, every breath caught between suspicion and hope. They followed the line, hearts pounding, feeling the eyes of America on them. Enemies on foreign soil, yet suddenly, inexplicably, treated with a shred of dignity. Behind them, the train doors slammed shut, sealing off the past. Ahead, the unknown waited. None of them could imagine how quickly their fears, and their understanding of the enemy, were about to be upended. Before they were prisoners, before they ever glimpsed the barbed wire of an American camp, these women had lives woven into the fabric of a nation, unraveling at the seams. They were not generals or architects of war. They were the quiet workers, the overlooked, the women who filled the spaces left behind when their fathers, brothers, and husbands vanished into the grinding jaws of the eastern and western fronts. In small towns and battered cities, they were nurses patching up wounded soldiers, their hands shaking as bombs fell beyond the hospital walls. Some were clerks, their days spent copying endless lists in drafty offices, rationing hope alongside bread and sugar. Others were kitchen helpers or laundry workers, doing what they could to stretch another week's worth of rations. A handful, heartbreakingly young, wore uniforms far too big for their shoulders, pressed into service as teenage auxiliaries when the Reich demanded more bodies than it had boys to spare. Propaganda posters hung on every wall. Smiling Aryan families, slogans promising victory, glory, and a better tomorrow. But beneath the slogans, reality bled through. Cities in ruins, food queues that stretched for blocks, air raid sirens that made mothers clutch their children and pray for the dawn. The older women remembered the hunger of the last war. The younger ones wondered if they'd ever know peace. For many, the end came suddenly. The war's final months swept over Germany like a tidal wave. Towns occupied, flags changed overnight, rumors swirling faster than facts. Some women were captured tending wounded soldiers on the retreat. Others were rounded up with factory workers, mistaken for combatants or collaborators. A few were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, swept along in the chaos as Allied lines pushed east. And so they became prisoners, not by choice or conviction, but by the accident of history. Daughters who'd watched fathers conscripted, mothers who'd stitched uniforms, young women who'd believed what they were told because it was all they knew. Some still clung to scraps of hope, a rumor that America treated prisoners well, that surrender might mean survival. Others feared the worst, haunted by stories of retribution. Their journeys to the camps began with cold fear and confusion. Some said goodbye to families they'd never see again. Some were herded onto trains with little more than a threadbare coat and a ration of bread. There were moments of defiance, too. A whispered song in the darkness, the squeeze of a friend's hand, the stubborn insistence that they would survive whatever came next. These women were not hardened soldiers. They were survivors, marked by war, branded as enemies, yet carrying with them memories of laughter, music, and the fragile hope that something better might still be possible. In another world, they might have been friends or neighbors to the women they would soon meet on the other side of the ocean. But here, fate had written a different story. As the trains rumbled west and the world they knew vanished behind them, none could have imagined how the next chapter would begin, not with cruelty or punishment, but with something far stranger. The terror of capture was fresh in their minds, but soon another shock awaited them, one that would challenge every story they'd been told about the enemy. The train journey west felt endless. Metal wheels clacked over rails that seemed to stretch into forever, carrying these German women farther from everything familiar. The cars were crowded, the air thick with the scent of fatigue, fear, and bodies pressed together. Sometimes there were long silences, each woman wrapped in her own thoughts, her own story. Other times, anxious voices whispered through the darkness, trading scraps of rumor and fragments of hope. At night, the only light came from passing towns or the dull glow of a lantern. In those hushed hours, memories surfaced, of families left behind, of laughter on summer nights, of sirens howling over bombed-out streets. Some clutched faded photographs or medals, the last fragile ties to a world that had vanished behind them. In one corner, a nurse scribbled nervously in her diary, careful to hide it when footsteps approached. "We do not know what awaits us in America. Are they as cruel as they say? Will they treat us like animals or worse? I try to be brave for the others, but my hands are shaking." Whispers fed the darkness. "They'll parade us through their towns as trophies. I heard they put women like us to hard labor, worse than the men." My neighbor's cousin never came back from captivity. Her letters just stopped. Some women tried to sound hopeful, insisting that Americans were fair, that the Geneva Convention would protect them. But fear hung heavy in the air, stoked by stories of vengeance and the ghosts of lost comrades. Food was sparse, and what little they received was plain but filling: bread, soup, an apple if they were lucky. At every stop, armed guards appeared, silent and alert. Sometimes a curious local would stare through the slats, their faces unreadable in the morning fog. Some women pressed close to the tiny windows, searching for a glimpse of what lay beyond: vast fields, distant mountains, endless sky. America seemed impossibly big, impossibly far from the ruins of home. There were moments of fragile camaraderie. A young girl, trembling with homesickness, was comforted by an older woman who quietly hummed a lullaby from her childhood. Another group traded stories about their villages, piecing together a patchwork of memories, reminding each other of the life that still waited, somewhere beyond the barbed wire. But there was also tension, a feeling that trust could dissolve at any moment if hope ran out. In the rare moments when the guards spoke, their accents were strange, sometimes brusque, sometimes oddly polite. Orders were barked in broken German, instructions repeated in English, and the women responded in whichever language they hoped would keep them safe. The uncertainty was constant, gnawing at every nerve. As the journey stretched on, fear mingled with exhaustion. The sun rose and set behind the dirty glass, and each morning The women wondered if this would be the day their questions found answers. When the train finally shuddered to a stop and the doors rattled open, a shiver ran through the crowd. They had reached their destination, but the terror in their hearts had never felt more real. Whatever waited outside, they were sure it would be worse than anything they had left behind. But the world on the other side of those doors would confound all their darkest expectations. The first steps off the train felt heavier than anything that had come before. The world outside was quiet and strange. Nothing but open land, framed by endless stretches of barbed wire and the steady presence of uniformed American soldiers. The guards stood with disciplined calm, their faces unreadable behind caps and mirrored sunglasses. The sun was rising now, bright and merciless, glinting off the wire and casting long shadows that looked, at first, like a new kind of cage. Every instinct screamed for vigilance. The women stayed close together, clutching their belongings, waiting for shouts, insults, perhaps a shove to remind them of their place. They expected anger. After all, they were the enemy. But as the group was ushered toward the camp's entrance, something surprising happened. The orders, delivered in accented German, were firm but not cruel. Please keep moving. Welcome to your new quarters. You will be safe here. The phrase lingered in the air. You will be safe here. For a moment, no one spoke. The barbed wire was real, but so was the unexpected politeness. At the processing table, women were handed identification tags and instructed, gently but efficiently, to line up for food. The kitchen staff, some of them American women, served portions of warm soup, bread, and fruit. One guard, young and clearly uncomfortable, offered a hesitant smile as he passed out trays. The prisoners exchanged looks of confusion and disbelief. Propaganda had painted Americans as brutes, ruthless, unforgiving, hungry for revenge. Yet here, at the very gates of their captivity, there was no shouting, no striking, no jeers. The absence of violence was almost unsettling in itself, as if the ground might shift beneath their feet at any moment. In the dormitories, rows of clean cots awaited them. There were blankets, not rags, pillows, not bundles of straw. The air inside smelled of soap and sawdust, not sweat and rot. A few women wept silently, overcome by exhaustion, but also by relief. A relief so sharp it felt dangerous to acknowledge. They had braced for humiliation, for beatings, for the full weight of an enemy's wrath. Instead, they found order, cleanliness, and, however strange it seemed, a measure of dignity. One nurse, skeptical and battered by years of loss, whispered, "What do they want from us?" No one could answer. Another pointed to a poster on the wall, printed in both English and German. Prisoners are to be treated with respect under the Geneva Convention. The words felt like a lifeline tossed into turbulent waters. Still, suspicion lingered. Every act of kindness was measured, analyzed, questioned. Was it a trick? Would it last? And yet, as the women began to settle into their bunks, a new sense of possibility flickered at the edges of their fear. For the first time in months, they allowed themselves to imagine that survival here might not mean suffering alone. As the women lined up for their first wash, a soldier stepped forward, holding something small and unexpected, a bar of soap. This simple gesture would mark the true beginning of their strange new lives, and nothing would be quite the same after. The line formed quietly outside the shower block, women clutching towels and, for the first time since their capture, small white bars of soap. The guard who distributed them, broad-shouldered, barely older than the youngest prisoners, did not speak as he handed each bar across. His eyes never quite met theirs, but his gesture was unmistakably gentle, the opposite of the harsh treatment so many had braced for. Each woman received her soap as if it were a priceless gift, holding it with a mixture of disbelief and suspicion. Inside, the shower room was bright and startlingly clean, steam already clouding the windows. Rows of shower heads gleamed against tiled walls. the sound of running water echoing off the stone. There was no cold spray, no filth, no shouting guards. Instead, the women found hot water, hotter than any of them had felt in months, maybe years, pouring down, soothing aching muscles, washing away the grime of war and exhaustion. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sounds were sighs, the occasional sob, the splatter of water on tile. It felt unreal. For so many, the memory of home was tangled up with deprivation, broken pipes, rationed soap, baths eked out in icy water. Now, here in a country that had once been only a faceless enemy, they stood side by side, letting warmth seep into their bones. Some lingered under the spray, afraid it might suddenly be taken away. One woman, an older nurse with tired hands, closed her eyes, letting the water run over her face. She remembered her own daughter's first bath as a baby, the way she'd cradled her, the scent of soap and the promise of safety. That memory crashed against the present in a way that nearly undid her. She felt her defenses soften, if only for a heartbeat. Yet, even amid comfort, awkwardness lingered. There was the constant awareness that their captors, these Americans, had provided this luxury. Could a bar of soap erase years of hatred, loss, propaganda? Was it mercy or a different kind of power? For some, it was a humiliation to accept anything from the enemy. For others, it was an unexpected moment of grace, a reminder that dignity could survive even in captivity. Not everyone wept or felt grateful. Some kept their eyes down, scrubbing quickly, eager to return to the safety of their bunks. A few, hardened by what they'd seen and lost, mistrusted the gesture entirely, convinced that this kindness could only be a prelude to cruelty. But even the most skeptical could not deny the relief of being clean, the comfort of warm skin, the flicker of hope it inspired. Back in the barracks, the change was palpable. The scent of soap clung to their hair and skin, a fragile shield against despair. Conversation was quieter, but less tense. Women exchanged shy smiles, shared combs, compared the brands of soap, some wrapped in paper stamped U.S. Army, others anonymous, but equally precious. In that small communal space, enemies became something closer to neighbors, if only for an afternoon. That night, as the camp settled into uneasy sleep, one young prisoner wrote in her diary, "I am still afraid, but today I was clean. Today I remembered what it was to feel human." The smallest gesture, a bar of soap, had shifted something fundamental. It did not erase the fences, the guards, or the ache for home, but it challenged every story these women had been told, about themselves and about their enemies. And so, daily life began to unfold behind the wire, filled with new routines, strange friendships, and quiet reckonings with the past. What came next would test not just survival, but the capacity for trust, resilience, and the rebuilding of identity in a world forever changed. Days began to find their rhythm, marked by routines that were strangely ordinary for a place defined by war and captivity. Every morning, a whistle sounded at sunrise. The women rose from their cots, folding blankets with practiced hands, exchanging quiet greetings and the occasional tentative smile. There was a comfort in repetition, in the knowledge of what would come next. Roll call, breakfast, chores, and the familiar rituals that had survived even the collapse of the world they once knew. Breakfast was simple. Oatmeal, sometimes eggs, thick slices of bread with butter or jam. The guards stood watch, not out of malice, but by protocol, their faces growing more familiar by the day. Occasionally, a guard might pause to answer a question or offer a second helping. In those moments, the lines between captor and captive blurred just slightly, though everyone was careful not to notice. After meals, work assignments were posted. There were beds to make, floors to scrub, gardens to tend. Some women were put to work in the laundry room, standing elbow to elbow, soap suds flying as they shared stories in hushed tones. Here, nationalities faded for a time. In the rhythm of washing, wringing, and folding, old prejudices were slowly worn down. A young German woman who had once feared all Americans found herself laughing quietly at a joke shared by a guard passing through. Another, who had lost her brother on the Eastern Front, confided her grief to a fellow prisoner whose own losses echoed her own. The medical checks came regularly. A kindly American nurse, her hair streaked with gray, her voice soft but firm, inspected wounds, handed out vitamins, and pressed cool hands to fevered brows. She listened when the women spoke of nightmares, of insomnia, of phantom pains that lingered long after old injuries had healed. In these brief, intimate moments, empathy often won out over suspicion. One prisoner, a former midwife, offered to help with sick children, and was surprised to find her skills genuinely welcomed by camp staff. Afternoons were for lessons and recreation. The camp commandant, believing in the importance of morale, organized English classes and book clubs. There were heated chess matches, sewing circles, and music drifting from open windows, fragments of German lullabies blending with American jazz. Women who had once viewed each other as rivals or strangers became companions, joined by the simple need to belong. Some friendships grew quietly, fostered in the privacy of whispered conversations and shared secrets. Others formed in the open, in the heat of a volleyball game or the comfort of communal prayer. Yet not all bonds came easily. Old resentments surfaced now and then, arguments over rations, accusations of favoritism, bitter reminders of the war's divisions. There were prisoners who refused to adapt, clinging to anger as a shield against vulnerability. And there were guards who kept their distance, wary of growing too familiar, worried that compassion might be mistaken for weakness. But the walls between them, literal and invisible, began to erode in tiny daily increments. Confessions emerged in unexpected places. In the laundry room, as shirts were scrubbed and stories exchanged, women spoke of things they had never admitted even to themselves. The guilt of survival, the shame of mistakes made in desperate times, the longing for forgiveness from those they would never see again. Some wrote letters home, though the words were heavily censored and every sentence chosen with care. Still, the act of writing, of reaching out across continents, provided a fragile lifeline. Evenings in the camp were a study in contrasts. After supper, the women gathered in small groups, reading or knitting by lamplight, sometimes sharing songs that made the guards pause at the doorways, lingering longer than necessary. The hum of conversation was occasionally interrupted by tears, by laughter that seemed almost rebellious, by the soft thud of a ball on the dusty yard. Under the watchful eyes of the sentries, life found a way to be lived, imperfectly but stubbornly. As the weeks passed, something inside the camp shifted. Trust grew slowly, a fragile plant rooted in necessity and watered by countless small acts of decency. No one forgot the war, or the reasons they wore different uniforms. But in the quiet spaces, over a shared pot of tea, a bandaged finger, a song half-remembered, enemies by flag became, if not friends, then fellow travelers on the uncertain road to peace. Yet as routines settled and bonds formed, new questions rose for both prisoners and guards. How much kindness could be allowed before duty was compromised? What did it mean to care for someone you were supposed to despise? Each day, these moral dilemmas loomed larger, preparing all for a reckoning neither side could have imagined. For the American guards, the arrival of German women POWs brought a unique mix of duty and discomfort. Many of the men standing watch were hardly older than the prisoners themselves. They'd been drafted from farms in Iowa, streets in Brooklyn, the immigrant tenements of Chicago, some with parents who still spoke German at the dinner table. Orders were clear: maintain discipline, show no favoritism. Remember that these women, whatever their stories, were still the enemy. Yet for all their training, nothing had truly prepared them for the reality of the camp. They'd expected hardened Nazi fanatics or silent, stone-faced captives. Instead, they found a collection of tired women, some gray-haired, some barely out of school, whose first questions were always about food, family, or news from home. In the early days, the guards kept their distance, watching with suspicion and sticking to protocol. But the routine wore down defenses. Small exchanges, polite requests for extra blankets, nervous smiles at the canteen became a language of their own. Some of the guards recognized fragments of their own childhoods in these women's voices. Lullabies sung in dialects their grandmothers used, recipes scribbled in the margins of old letters, even the same prayers whispered at night. One guard, whose father had fled Germany decades before, found himself drawn into awkward conversations, searching for the right words to bridge the gulf between war and memory. Instructions were often at odds with conscience. A letter arrived from home. His sister was ill, his mother worried. And suddenly, the guard saw the prisoner's longing for news in a different light. He noticed the way one woman held a letter to her heart for hours, rereading it until the paper nearly fell apart. Another day, he caught himself laughing quietly at a joke shared in broken English, surprised by how ordinary it felt. Rumors sometimes swirled among the guards. Would kindness be reported as weakness? Was it right to offer a second helping of stew or an extra hour in the yard? Some officers warned against getting too close, reminding their men of the war still raging overseas. Yet in quiet moments, doubts crept in. Did victory demand unbending hearts? As the seasons changed and holidays approached, the lines between guard and prisoner grew more complex. The camp prepared for Thanksgiving, Christmas, and the New Year. The sight of handmade decorations and the sound of carols drifting from the women's barracks tugged at memories of home. Some guards brought small comforts: an orange, a newspaper, a handful of chocolate bars tucked into coat pockets, and passed along with a conspiratorial wink. The camp, once defined only by suspicion and separation, became a place where humanity quietly asserted itself. Laughter echoed down the corridors, mingling with homesick tears and the hope carried in every letter. The guards, who had expected to be changed by discipline and routine, found themselves transformed instead by moments of empathy they could neither explain nor resist. And as the first snow dusted the camp, the question lingered for both prisoners and guards. What could be shared, and what must remain forbidden when the world outside was still at war? The answer would be revealed as the holidays approached, bringing with them both comfort and new anxieties that no one on either side could ignore. In the quiet corners of the barracks, paper became a lifeline. Every woman, it seemed, guarded a cherished pencil stub and a few worn sheets of stationery. Writing home was both a privilege and a risk, the only way to bridge the aching gulf between captivity and the world left behind. The rules were clear. Every letter would be censored, every word read by eyes on both sides of the Atlantic. Yet, desperation breeds ingenuity, and the women quickly learned the language of hints and omissions, codes woven into seemingly harmless lines. "Dearest Mother," one letter began, the writer careful to mention the weather and the kindness of the guards, but to avoid anything that might sound like complaint or confession. In another, a line about missing the lilacs by the river stood in for an entire village lost to bombing. Sometimes, the women wrote of dreams, reunions, laughter, dinners that lasted long into the night, knowing that hope was as much a gift to those at home as to themselves. Every reply was a small miracle. When the mail cart rattled into camp, everything stopped. Conversations froze, games were abandoned, hands clasped in anticipation. A letter from home might be a few sentences, a scrap of news, a child's drawing, or a pressed flower. Each one was read over and over, hidden beneath mattresses or sewn into seams, softening the loneliness for a day or two. But the letters also carried fear. Coded warnings filtered in, stories of neighbors taken away, property seized. Old friends who now wore strange uniforms or no longer answered the door. The women wondered who would be left when, if they returned. Would they be seen as survivors, traitors, collaborators, or simply forgotten by a world desperate to move on? Each woman's hope was sharpened by doubt. To send a letter meant trusting strangers, sometimes even bribing a guard with cigarettes or a hand-stitched handkerchief to ensure it reached the post. There were rumors that some messages never left the camp, intercepted or lost to bureaucracy or suspicion. Still, the women wrote, knowing that silence was worse than the risk. One night, as Christmas neared, a group of women pooled their rations to craft makeshift holiday cards. They sang carols in low voices, sending melodies and memories across the ocean with every note. The guards listened quietly at the door, perhaps thinking of their own families, of mothers waiting by windows, of daughters asleep under patchwork quilts. In the gentle glow of the holiday season, the line between prisoner and guard blurred. For a moment, hope became a language everyone understood, a fragile truce forged not by treaty, but by the ache for home. That night, as the snow fell softly beyond the barbed wire, it seemed as if the world, so fractured and divided, might find common ground in the simplest longing: to be remembered and to belong. On Christmas Eve, the camp was changed by quiet anticipation. Snow had fallen all afternoon, softening the sharp edges of barbed wire and turning the parade ground to white. Inside the barracks, the German women moved with a nervous kind of hope, pinning makeshift decorations from scraps of cloth and colored paper, humming songs that belonged to another world. For days, they'd saved extra bits of bread and jam, traded favors for apples and hard candy, determined to make this night feel different, even if only in memory. As dusk settled, an unexpected invitation arrived. The American commandant, after conferring with his staff and the Red Cross, announced a joint celebration, one meal together for prisoners and guards alike. The news swept through the camp, disbelief battling with excitement. Was it a trick, or a gift they'd scarcely dared to hope for? In the mess hall, tables were pushed together and covered with white sheets. There were candles flickering in borrowed glass jars, their light dancing over faces that had once only seen each other in suspicion and fear. The meal itself was simple: roast chicken, potatoes, even a small cake at the center of each table. But it felt like a banquet. For the first time since their arrival, the women ate slowly, savoring every bite, warmed by more than the food. Conversation grew. Awkward at first, then easier. Stories of Christmases past were shared, some funny, some sorrowful. One American guard, cheeks flushed with shyness, played Silent Night on an old harmonica. The familiar melody drew voices together, first hesitantly, then in harmony, English blending with German, the song carrying old hurts and new hope in every note. Laughter rose, mingled with tears. For a moment, no one was a prisoner, no one a guard. They were simply people, sharing in the smallest joys, holding space for each other's loneliness. That night, the boundaries that defined the camp faded. The war, for a few sacred hours, stopped at the gates. Hearts softened, if only temporarily. Even the cold seemed less biting as they returned to their bunks, the echoes of carols and conversation lingering in the quiet. But as the candles burned low, a different kind of silence settled in, a bittersweet reminder that such moments could not last. Tomorrow the rules would return. The world outside would keep on fighting. Yet for one night, in the heart of captivity, they had found what war tried so hard to erase, a sense of shared humanity, fleeting and unforgettable. The end came quietly at first. A rumor, a headline in a crumpled newspaper, the sudden shift in the way guards spoke and moved through the camp. When news of Germany's surrender reached the women, it landed with the weight of a life raft and an anchor both. Some cheered or wept, overcome by the simple truth that the war was finally over. Others stared into the distance, struggling to grasp what freedom would truly mean. Within days, the routines that had once governed every moment began to unravel. The rules loosened. Chores and roll calls faded into memory. Guards who had once kept strict watch now shared uncertain smiles, lingering in the knowledge that their own roles would soon end. Each morning brought new rumors about transport lists, about ships and trains preparing to carry the prisoners home. The air was heavy with anticipation, but also with fear. Freedom was not the joyous reunion that many had imagined in their darkest hours. Some women, after months or even years of captivity, realized they were leaving behind the only sense of community they'd known since the war began. Bonds forged in hardship, friendships, surrogate families, even tentative affection for a few kind guards, would be broken with the closing of a gate. There were hurried goodbyes, gifts pressed into hands, addresses scribbled onto scraps of paper. Promises were made. We will write. We will find each other again. Some kept these promises. Others let the threads fray in the chaos of return. The journey back to Germany was slow and bewildering. The land they passed through was changed. Towns in ruins, fields scorched, train stations crowded with the displaced. The women were greeted by a world that scarcely recognized them. Neighbors gossiped, unsure whether to offer comfort or suspicion. Some returned to homes now occupied by strangers, others to villages that no longer existed. Children had grown, loved ones had vanished, and the landscape of memory no longer matched reality. Stigma clung to many, especially those suspected of collaborating or simply for surviving when so many had not. A few, lucky or resilient, were welcomed with gratitude, hailed for having endured. Others found only silence. In the weeks and months that followed, letters crisscrossed Europe and America. Some delivered, others lost. Old camp friends tried to reconnect, to hold on to the fragile bonds that had saved them during the worst days. Some women found solace in these new, scattered families, reminders that what they'd shared in captivity could never be entirely erased. But the scars remained. Nightmares persisted, as did the habits of prison life. Folding clothes with military precision, hiding bits of bread, flinching at the sound of sudden footsteps. For years, the women measured their lives in before and after. Before the camp, after the barbed wire, before the war, after the silence. Some managed to share their stories, determined to be remembered as more than victims or enemies. Others locked those memories away, speaking of them only in coded words, if at all. A handful even returned to America years later, invited by families of former guards, or as guests of reconciliation groups. There were reunions marked by tears and laughter, by shared photographs and long, searching conversations. A few guards sent letters, sometimes in halting German, sometimes in fluent English, reminding the women that the boundaries of war had not wholly erased their humanity. Freedom, it turned out, was complicated. Going home was both an ending and a beginning, a new struggle to find meaning in a world forever changed. Yet, for all the pain and uncertainty, the women carried with them the indelible truth of their survival, that, in the darkest days, compassion could cross even the most impenetrable lines, and that dignity, once granted, could never be entirely taken away. As life moved forward and the world began to rebuild, the memory of those months in captivity, of friendships born in hardship, of unexpected kindness, of the small moments that made survival possible, remained. These stories, hidden but enduring, would one day find their voice, reshaping not only the lives of those who lived them, but also the generations that followed. Time has softened the edges of the old photographs. They sit in drawers and albums across continents, faded images of women in uniforms, letters in looping script, a pressed flower tucked between pages. Decades have passed since those long days behind wire, but the stories still ripple outward, shaping lives in ways the original storytellers could never have imagined. In living rooms and classrooms, descendants gather around the fragments left behind. A grandmother's memory of a Christmas spent in a foreign camp, a diary written in a language only half remembered, a handful of letters bound with ribbon and hope. Historians, too, sift through archives, uncovering testimonies and official records, piecing together the mosaic of what truly happened. Each discovery is a reminder that history isn't just battles and treaties. It is heartbreak and endurance, the choices of ordinary people caught in extraordinary times. For some families, these stories open doors to forgiveness. Grandchildren and great-grandchildren reach out across oceans, seeking connections with those once labeled as enemies. For others, the stories are a map to understanding, a way to make sense of scars that lingered long after the war was over, of silences at dinner tables, of resilience passed down quietly through generations. And so, the past does not remain silent. The story didn't end in 1945. It endures in the laughter and tears of those who inherited it, in the lessons whispered from one generation to the next. Perhaps there is a hidden story in every family, waiting to be uncovered, a reminder that even in humanity's darkest chapters, small acts of kindness, survival, and hope can echo far beyond their moment in history. If you listen closely, you may hear these echoes in your own family too. Perhaps it's time to ask, to remember, and to honor the untold histories that live quietly in the people we love.